Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. The Department of Transportation Control Center in our city isn't glamorous. It's a rectangular floor of glass and steel high up on the 12th story of the administration building, with rows of workstations facing a wall of monitors big enough to make an old movie theater jealous. On quiet nights, it feels like I'm sitting in the bridge of a ship that isn't going anywhere. My desk is in the northeast corner, right by the bank of windows, which on nights like this show the city skyline lit in amber sodium vapor glow. My name's Daniel Mercer, Senior Traffic Systems Engineer. That sounds more important than it is. I monitor bridge status, tunnel air handling systems, metro electrical distribution, and surface traffic flow across 512 cameras scattered through the metro area. We're the nerve center for everything that moves people in or out of the city. The police handle the law, the health department handles the sick, and we handle the roads, rails, and river crossings. It was Friday night, 22:47 hours on my shift log, when the first anomaly came in. Not an alarm, just a sharp ping from my workstation. The North Bay Tunnel exhaust fans had ramped to full power without a command. I tapped the controls, brought up the environmental readouts. CO2 was fine, oxygen levels normal. No smoke or particulates detected. But the cameras. I switched the feed from fan controls to the tunnel north portal. The 4 lanes in each direction were at a dead stop. Horns blared in the distance, muffled by the microphone's compression. In the glow of brake lights, I could see pedestrians weaving through the cars, only there shouldn't be pedestrians in the tunnel. "Hey Kim," I called to the night supervisor 2 rows ahead. "North Bay's at a standstill. I've got people on foot between vehicles." Kim Lawson was ex-military, ran her station like a field post. She spun her chair, eyebrow raised. "Breakdown?" I shook my head, gesturing to the monitors. Multiple, at least 50 people on foot, moving westbound in the eastbound lanes. She rolled over to my console, leaned in to watch. On camera 2, a man in a dark coat staggered against the median, ignoring a horn blasting inches from his ear. Another figure shoved a driver back into their car and kept walking. Kim muttered, "What the hell?" Then tapped her headset. "Dispatch, this is Control Center. I need a traffic unit at the North Bay eastbound portal now. We've got pedestrians blocking traffic inside the tube. Possible hazard." I didn't hear the reply, but her expression tightened. She rolled back to her station and started making calls. I kept watching. The pedestrians weren't just wandering, they were moving with a slow, deliberate momentum, as though drawn by something ahead. The tunnel's directional mics picked up the scrape of shoes on concrete, a sound I usually associate with the aftermath of accidents when emergency crews walk the lanes. Then the second ping hit my station. East Span Bridge, traffic speed sensors offline. I switched views. The bridge, a 3-kilometer sweep of steel and suspension cables over the river, was jammed solid, both directions. Brake lights glowed in the fog, but the view from camera 14, a mid-span PTZ, showed more pedestrians weaving through lanes, some climbing over hoods. A city bus sat sideways, front door open, no driver in sight. Behind me, the radio chatter rose a notch. Call signs were overlapping. Kim's voice cut through, sharper now. "Copy that, PD. You're saying units at North Bay are not responding?" "Understood. I'll escalate." At 22:58, the alert banner slid across my screen. "Unidentified public safety incident. All crossings under observation." The message was from the Office of Emergency Management Top Priority Encryption. I'd worked storms, blackouts, even a hazmat tanker fire, This was different. Hazards have data, temperature spikes, toxic gas readings, structural alarms. Here, all we had were pictures of people walking where they shouldn't, causing gridlock that could paralyze the city in under an hour. The third anomaly hit a minute later, South Channel Bridge pedestrian intrusion alarm. I brought it up and froze. The south approach lanes were packed. A sedan on the shoulder was surrounded by people pounding on the windows. The driver gunned the engine, but with nowhere to go, it only revved uselessly. The feed's audio caught a muffled, frantic horn blast, then the driver's side window shattered. I took off my headset and stood. "Kim, you need to see this." She didn't even come over this time, just shouted, "Put it on main wall." I patched the South Channel feed to the grid of giant monitors. Every engineer on shift stopped what they were doing. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Kim's phone rang. The hardline, the one that only rings when the call comes from City Command. She answered, listened, nodded once. "Understood. We'll lock all crossings immediately." She hung up, looked at me. "Mercer, you're on bridges. Seal East Span, South Channel, North Bay, and Midtown. Do it now." That's not a request you make lightly. Closing even one major crossing snarls the city for hours. Closing all four was, well, I'd never heard of it outside of a hurricane or a terrorism drill. "Is this a drill?" I asked. Her expression made it clear it wasn't. "They're saying there's a contamination event. Orders are to keep everyone inside the perimeter. No exceptions." I keyed in the commands, bridge by bridge. Heavy gate arms lowered at the approaches. Lane control boards flashed red X's across every lane. Tunnel ventilation fans cycled to purge, but I saw on the feeds that the pedestrians didn't care. They just kept coming, moving through cars, some climbing barriers like they weren't even there. That's when my personal phone buzzed. The caller ID read, "Sarah Mobile, my sister." I hesitated. Kim caught my glance and said, "Make it fast." I answered, "Sarah? Where are you?" Her voice was shaky, wind rushing on her end. "Danny? I'm on the East Span, westbound, traffic's not moving. People are attacking cars. Someone pulled a guy out of his truck. He's not moving." My stomach tightened. "Listen to me. Stay in the car, lock the doors, don't get out. Do you hear me?" She was crying now. "They're breaking windows, Danny. The line cut into static." I stared at the phone, heart hammering, while on the big screens, the East Span feed showed exactly what she'd just described. I kept my eyes on the East Span feed, fingers frozen above the controls. The westbound lanes were clogged tight, brake lights pulsing red through the light fog that clung to the suspension cables. People were climbing over guardrails and between bumpers, moving without hesitation or any sign of panic that made sense. They didn't scatter when horns blared or when drivers tried to push through. They pressed forward in small clusters, closing on any vehicle that wasn't moving. On one camera, I saw a compact SUV rock violently as several figures crowded around it. The glass gave way in a single muffled burst, and the cluster shifted inside like a tide rushing through a breach. I forced myself to keep breathing evenly. I'd been in the control room during incidents before, chemical tanker overturns, winter pileups, even a suicide jumper, but there had always been a clear documented chain of action. You rerouted traffic, dispatched units, sealed an area. Tonight, there was no containment plan, no public broadcast, no on-screen status other than unidentified public safety incident. That was an understatement on the level of calling a hurricane inclement weather. Kim's voice broke through the low murmur of the room. She was on her headset again, speaking to someone with clipped precision. "East Span inbound lanes sealed. No, they're already blocked. We have multiple pedestrian intrusions on all crossings. Midtown is holding for now." She paused, listening. "Yes, we have visual. No, PD response is not stabilizing the situation. Acknowledged." She ended the call and swiveled her chair toward me. "City Command wants us to keep all gates locked until further notice. They're moving guard units into staging." I didn't ask the obvious question. Why the guard? That answer was already in the video feeds. Whatever this was, it was past the point of normal law enforcement response. The South Channel camera panned under remote control from another station, revealing a 6-lane approach littered with abandoned vehicles. In the distance, a pair of hazard strobes flashed where an emergency truck had been left crosswise across the lanes. There was no sign of the crew. I pulled up the bridge status interface, checking each crossing's mechanical locks. All 4 primary gates were engaged, and hydraulic barriers were raised on both sides. For the tunnels, blast doors were partially lowered, enough to slow foot traffic, not enough to trap anyone still inside. My training told me that was intentional, to avoid civilian casualties during containment. My gut told me it wouldn't be enough. An urgent chime drew my attention to the console again. It was a direct message flagged Command Level Access Only. I keyed it open. Full lockdown of secondary crossings authorized. Priority: prevent egress from containment perimeter. Secure rail, ferry, and pedestrian bridges immediately. The signature at the bottom belonged to the Deputy Director of the Office of Emergency Management. I'd only met him once, during a disaster drill. He'd been calm, methodical. Seeing his name on an order like this drove home the scale of whatever was unfolding outside. I acknowledged the order and began closing the smaller crossings one by one. The Redwood pedestrian bridge over the Industrial Canal, the Pier 22 commuter ferry, the light rail link running parallel to the riverfront. All shut down within minutes. Screens around me updated with red status bands, each labeled Locked Containment. A few operators glanced my way but said nothing. We all knew the moment for casual conversation had passed. The big wall display cycled through updated feeds, and I caught sight of a familiar frame. A gray sedan wedged between a semi and a median barrier on the east span. The hood was dented, the driver's side door open. I couldn't see the plate from this angle, but I didn't need to. My sister drove the same model, same color. My throat went dry. I forced myself to pan the camera, trying to catch another angle, but a patch of mist rolled through and the autofocus fought to keep up. By the time it cleared, the sedan was empty. I kept my hands on the controls longer than I needed to, just to avoid turning away. My mind ran through possible explanations. Maybe she'd made it to another car. Maybe she was with a police unit. The alternative was something I wasn't ready to consider, not with the feeds showing what they were showing. I closed the camera feed before I could look again and moved to the next task in the queue. An alert window popped up, Midtown tunnel breach detected. The breach code wasn't for structural damage. It was for access point override, meaning someone had manually opened an emergency hatch. The system automatically switched the nearest camera onto my screen. The view showed the service walkway along the tunnel wall, dimly lit by sodium lamps. 2 figures in city utility uniforms were forcing an inner door open with a crowbar. Beyond them, shadows moved in the main traffic lanes. One of the uniformed men glanced back toward the approaching shapes, then slipped inside, pulling the other with him. Protocol said I should log the breach, forward the feed to the operations log, and notify the incident commander. But before I could even start, the camera feed blinked to black. A signal lost icon replaced the view. I checked the camera status, offline. The next 2 in sequence were dead as well. Whatever was moving through that tunnel had taken the surveillance offline within a minute. Kim must have seen my screen. She rose from her station and came over. That's not an equipment fault. Get me every remaining Midtown cam up on your board." I did, and the patchwork picture that emerged was worse than I expected. The westbound lanes were mostly empty of vehicles now, but scattered figures moved steadily toward the inner city portal. Some limped, some ran with an awkward, bounding gait, but all of them moved in the same direction, toward the city. The police unit stationed at the portal had already backed their SUV across the entrance, lights flashing. One officer stood in the lane, shouting something toward the oncoming shapes. He kept his stance until the first of them closed to within 30 feet. Then the feed cut out. The next few minutes blurred together in a haze of status changes, loss of visual, and escalating orders from above. Every time we tried to track the movement of these intruders, we lost another camera. The street grid inside the city began to clog, not just at the periphery but deep in the downtown core. Whatever had started on the bridges and tunnels was already inside. Kim finally called for a complete feed consolidation. "Forget the periphery," she told the room. "Pull every camera we've got inside the containment zone. I want eyes on major intersections, transit hubs, hospitals, and municipal buildings." I heard the edge in her tone. She knew as well as I did that containment was no longer about keeping it out. It was about buying time before whatever this was overwhelmed the center. I cued the hospital feeds first. If this was some sort of contamination, the ERs would be first to feel the strain. The view from City General's ambulance bay showed 2 units backed in, doors open, gurneys on the ground. There was movement, but no organized reception. On the east side of the frame, a figure in scrubs stumbled against the wall and slid down, leaving a dark smear behind. A second later, the camera went black. Somewhere in the middle of this, my personal phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Sarah. The number was unfamiliar. I almost let it go, but instinct made me answer. A male voice spoke in a rush. "Mercer, this is Detective Randall, Harbor Precinct. I found your sister. She's alive, but we can't get off the bridge. There's no way through." He didn't have to explain the rest. I could picture exactly where they were. Trapped somewhere on the east span, hemmed in on both sides. Randall's voice was steady, but beneath it I could hear the low chorus of horns, the rumble of idling engines, and a sharper sound. Metal striking metal in irregular bursts. It wasn't the chaotic clatter of an accident. It was deliberate, methodical, like someone prying open a series of locked compartments. I pictured them on the east span, surrounded on both sides by the jammed mass of vehicles I'd been monitoring all night. Even if every pedestrian in that mess had been a stranded commuter, there was no physical way to clear a path without heavy equipment. But they weren't commuters, and that changed everything. I kept my voice even, asking for his position on the bridge. He gave me a marker point, Sector 14 westbound, close to the center span where the view was widest, but the exits were the farthest away. That stretch was designed for maximum load bearing, with reinforced barriers that made foot access nearly impossible from the outer edge. In a normal incident, that would make them safer. Tonight, it made them a target trapped in a box. I pulled up the East Span control interface, overriding the public camera priority to get a private sequence through my console. The mid-span camera was still online, its angle sweeping over the westbound lanes. I zoomed in and caught a glimpse of the Harbor PD unit, hazard lights flashing, parked just ahead of a small cluster of vehicles. I recognized the gray sedan behind it instantly, Sarah's. Beside the sedan, a figure crouched low, speaking to someone through the driver's window. Randall, I guessed. Beyond that, in the eastbound lanes, the mass of oncoming pedestrians moved with steady persistence, forcing their way through the static line of cars. There were no breaks in their movement, no hesitation when they encountered obstacles. I saw one man in a high-visibility vest climb over the hood of a panel van, stepping on the windshield with his full weight until the glass fractured under him. Another approached the back of a delivery truck, tried the latch, and when it didn't open, began slamming a length of metal bar against it in a rhythm that made my teeth ache. I muted my phone mic and glanced across the room to Kim. She was coordinating with state-level command now, her voice low but urgent, her attention locked on the unfolding situation in the downtown core. If I asked for bridge clearance for a single vehicle, it would draw questions I wasn't prepared to answer. The protocol was clear. No one left, no one entered. But if Randall had already made it halfway across with my sister, that meant there was still a chance to get them off before the crowd reached critical density. Randall's voice cut back in over the phone. "Mercer, whatever these people are, they're not right. They don't stop. We've tried warning shots, shouting. Nothing works. They just keep moving toward us. I've got maybe 20 minutes before they're on top of this position. Less if they find a way through the truck line." I thought quickly. The east span had maintenance catwalks running beneath the main deck, accessible from locked service hatches at intervals along the span. They were used for cable inspections and, in rare cases, as escape routes when the roadway above was blocked. If Randall could get Sarah down to one of those hatches, I could release the lock from here and give them access to the maintenance route that led to the western shore. It wasn't without risk. The hatches were narrow, the stairwells steep, and the catwalks were open to the wind and river below. In darkness, with minimal lighting, it would be slow going. But slow was better than standing still in the middle of a tightening perimeter. I told him about the hatch option, giving the nearest ID number and explaining the sequence he'd see when I opened it. 3 red lights followed by a single green. That green meant the locking pins had retracted and the door was clear to pull open. He didn't hesitate, just acknowledged and told me he'd move now. The feed on my screen showed movement around the Harbor PD unit. 2 figures broke from cover, Randall and a smaller form in a dark jacket that matched the one I'd seen Sarah wear at family dinners. They stayed low, moving between vehicles toward the narrow maintenance zone against the guardrail. The pedestrians in the eastbound lanes were closer now, maybe 50 meters from the barricade of stalled trucks and SUVs. Even from the camera's distant vantage point, their movement felt wrong, too linear, too focused, as if each one shared the same fixed point ahead. I triggered the unlock sequence for the hatch. The confirmation indicator lit on my screen, and a few seconds later, Randall's voice came back, shorter now, breathless. "We're in, heading down. Keep it open." Then the line went dead. I switched to the underdeck camera that faced the catwalks. Through the grainy night vision feed, I caught faint shapes moving along the steel grating, 2 of them close together, the smaller one clinging to the handrail. Behind them, the dark shape of the hatchway was closing. For now, they were below the deck and out of direct sight from the roadway above. It was a calculated relief, because inside the city perimeter, everything was getting worse. Reports were coming in from the light rail dispatchers. Multiple trains halted in tunnels, crews unresponsive. The ferry terminal cameras showed an empty pier, gangways raised, but the water-level cameras beneath the dock picked up irregular movement in the shallows, and the hospital feeds, what was left of them, showed corridors where people moved in the same slow, forward-leaning gait I'd seen on the bridges. Kim stepped away from her console for the first time in an hour and came to stand beside me, her eyes flicking over my screen without comment. "We've lost Midtown completely," she said quietly. "Command wants to shift all attention to protecting the core from within. That means sealing off the Civic District, closing metro power to the outlying stations, and pulling traffic cameras to the central square." I nodded, hands moving over the keyboard. As the feeds switched, I caught fleeting glimpses of city streets half lit by failing grid power. In the residential blocks, some lights burned steadily, others flickered as if power lines were under strain. Downtown, the wide avenues were beginning to choke with abandoned vehicles left at odd angles, like the drivers had simply stepped away mid-commute. Somewhere, in those streets, the same movement patterns were repeating. Individuals or small groups pressing forward without apparent destination except inward. And from the pace they were keeping, I estimated we had less than an hour before the core itself was compromised. I didn't know if Randall and Sarah could cover the catwalk route to the shore in that time, but I'd just made myself part of their escape. That meant I needed them clear, not just for personal reasons, but because in another hour, the river might be the only barrier left worth holding. The river had always been an invisible boundary in our city, more symbolic than practical. People crossed it daily without thinking. Bridges, ferries, the light rail span. It wasn't wide enough to be a natural barrier to anything determined, and yet, tonight, it was the last real line we had left. If the movement we were tracking crossed that water in force, there would be nothing to stop it spreading into the suburbs and beyond. And I had just opened a way across for two people who mattered to me more than anyone else still breathing. The control center was running on reduced lighting now, the overhead fluorescence dimmed to ease eye strain. The glow from the massive wall of screens dominated the space, casting pale illumination over faces that looked a shade older than they had at the start of the shift. Every operator had their headset on, voices low and constant as they relayed data to law enforcement, transit command, and emergency management. The air was tense but controlled. This was still the early stage where people believe coordination can turn the tide. I knew better. The cameras don't lie, and the feeds were showing a spread that didn't care about perimeters. My own console was split into three main views. The underdeck catwalk where Randall and Sarah had been moments before. The central civic district where command was focusing its defensive efforts, and the midtown sector where we'd already lost functional oversight. The catwalk feed was holding, but the movement had slowed. Randall was likely having to half carry Sarah along the graded walkway. The crosswinds under the bridge could hit 30 miles an hour at night, and with minimal railings, every step demanded focus. I kept the feed small in the corner of my screen, forcing myself not to watch it constantly. The civic district cams showed barricades going up, city trucks parked broadside, sand-filled barriers dragged into place by front-end loaders, police units forming controlled choke points at each main approach. On paper, it looked like a textbook urban cordon. On the street, you could see the limitations. Too few personnel, too many entry points, and the wrong kind of opposition. This wasn't a crowd you could disperse with tear gas or block with a single line of riot shields. They didn't break, didn't react to the usual cues that turned most disturbances back. I pulled up the Metro power grid overlay, isolating the core stations from the outlying lines. The order was to shut down everything beyond the civic perimeter. That meant forcing trains to halt inside tunnels rather than letting them reach the outer platforms where escape might still be possible. I hesitated before initiating the sequence, knowing I'd be trapping commuters underground. But Kim's voice cut across the room. Power down the outliers now. No exceptions. The perimeter holds, or we lose the whole grid. I keyed the sequence. One by one, the indicators for the outer stations went dark. Reports of stalled trains began to roll in almost immediately, some with passengers on board, others with only crew. In normal circumstances, we'd begin evacuation protocols within minutes. Tonight, those protocols were suspended. The logic was brutal. Better to leave those tunnels sealed than to open another uncontrolled pathway into the core. The underdeck feed flickered, For a second, I thought we'd lost the camera, but then it resolved into an image that made my pulse jump. Two new figures moving on the catwalk ahead of Randall and Sarah, heading toward them from the shore. The low-light sensors struggled to pick out details, but the gait was unmistakable. They moved with that same fixed, forward-tilted momentum we'd been seeing all night. The catwalk was narrow enough that there would be no passing without contact. I switched to the next camera down the line to track their approach. The wind carried loose strands of hair from one figure's head across their face, but they didn't brush them away. The other's arms swung in a stiff arc, more pendulum than stride. Behind them, in the open water, I caught movement. Just enough to see that the river was no longer empty. Dark shapes, too low to be boats, were drifting with the current toward the base of the bridge. If Randall saw them yet, he didn't break pace. In the next frame, I saw him shift Sarah to his left side and draw something from his belt. A collapsible baton, the kind detectives carried when they needed reach without going to firearms immediately. Against one or two, it might be enough to buy space. On a catwalk, suspended over a river, it was better than nothing. The Civic District feeds pulled my attention back for a moment. The approaches were now in direct contact. The first line of intruders had reached the barricades, pressing into the vehicles and barriers without hesitation. Officers moved forward in formation, but there was no visible reaction from the crowd. No flinch at the warning shouts, no pause when physical force was applied. They simply absorbed the impacts, shifted around obstacles, and kept advancing. It wasn't a riot in the traditional sense. It was closer to a tide moving inland. One of the municipal building feeds showed the mayor's convoy pulling into the underground garage, escorted by two armored SUVs. It was a sign of just how far this had escalated. Those vehicles were reserved for the highest level emergencies. The garage gate dropped behind them, and the camera cut out, either disabled intentionally or from a system overload. I brought the catwalk feed back to full screen. Randall had reached the two oncomers. The encounter was brief and violent. 3 quick swings of the baton, one figure knocked sideways into the railing, the other pressed back a step before lunging again. The limited view made it hard to track each movement, but I saw enough to know Randall wasn't slowing to finish the fight. He used the momentary space to push past, keeping Sarah between him and the inner rail. The figures turned and followed without hesitation. The next shore camera showed the catwalk exit hatch, a squat metal door recessed into the concrete anchorage of the bridge. I overrode the lock before Randall even reached it, holding it open on the off chance the mechanism failed. The system gave me a flashing warning. Hatch integrity compromised, physical damage detected. That meant someone had forced it earlier, bending the frame enough to trip the sensor. I didn't like the implications. If the hatch was already breached from the inside, then the shore beyond might not be clear. On the Civic feeds, the perimeter was bowing in multiple locations. 2 barricades had already been pushed back enough to allow partial entry, and command was ordering tactical retreats to secondary lines. It was only a matter of time before the center itself was engaged. If Randall and Sarah didn't clear the hatch in the next few minutes, they'd be coming up on a shore that was about to be as compromised as the bridge they'd left behind. And if the shapes in the river reached those supports, the barrier I'd counted on to buy us time would be gone before the hour was up. The underdeck camera held steady on the hatch as the 2 figures drew closer through the dim green of the night vision overlay. The wind was up, pushing small swells against the concrete anchorage below, and the metal grating of the catwalk rattled under their steps. Randall was half guiding, half pulling Sarah now, his free hand still clutching the baton as if letting it go for even a second would be an invitation for whatever was behind them to close the distance. In the background, the 2 shapes that had been trailing them were still advancing, closing steadily despite the wind and the slick metal underfoot. I overrode the warning prompt for the hatch integrity again and forced the lock open. The heavy steel door shifted slightly but didn't swing all the way. The warped frame was holding it in place. Randall reached it and, without hesitation, wedged his shoulder into the gap, pushing hard until the seal gave with a groan that I could almost hear through the feed. Sarah slipped through first, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Randall followed, yanking the door closed behind him. The moment it sealed, I re-engaged the lock from my end. But my relief was short-lived. The shoreline camera beyond the hatch showed a narrow maintenance platform along the water's edge, littered with equipment crates and coiled marine cable. To the right, a service road curved up toward the levee. To the left, an open stretch of chain-link fence separated the platform from a gravel loading area where several vehicles sat under dim floodlights. At least a dozen figures were moving there, and even from this angle I could tell they weren't dock workers. The rigid posture, the uniformity of their movement, it was the same pattern we'd seen spreading across the city. Randall and Sarah emerged onto the platform in the next frame. Randall scanned the area quickly, then guided her toward the service road. The figures by the fence didn't appear to have noticed them yet, but it was only a matter of time. My eyes flicked between that feed and the water-level camera. The shapes I'd spotted earlier were closer now, riding the current toward the anchorage. Their movement was unnatural for debris. They kept a fixed course, even against the slight eddies near the supports, as though drawn toward the structure itself. Inside the control center, the situation board updated again. 2 more Civic District barricades breached, and reports of rapid infiltration in the Municipal Records Building. That was less than 2 blocks from City Hall. The comms channel was alive with terse updates, units pulling back, intersections being abandoned, and repeated calls for reinforcements that weren't coming. The outer sectors had already gone silent in most places, which meant whatever had breached them was now operating without organized resistance. I switched the shoreline feed to the main wall, ignoring the glance Kim gave me from across the room. I needed eyes on Randall's route, in case there was a way to help. The service road curved sharply after about 50 meters, disappearing behind a stack of shipping containers. If he could make it past that turn before the figures by the fence reacted, he might have a clear run to the levee road. From there, a small footbridge crossed into the industrial park, and beyond that, the riverfront fire station, one of the few municipal sites still reporting as secure. Randall and Sarah reached the bend just as one of the floodlights flickered and went dark. The shadows from the containers shifted, swallowing them from view. At the same moment, the figures at the fence stopped their slow pacing and turned toward the platform in unison. I had no audio from that camera, but the way they moved, suddenly faster, more direct, told me something had alerted them. Whether it was sound, sight, or something else entirely, I couldn't tell. I adjusted the nearby traffic camera to cover the levee road approach. A few seconds later, Randall and Sarah appeared in the frame, moving at a near run now. Randall had his arm around her shoulders, pushing her forward. The gravel under their feet kicked up in light bursts as they climbed the incline. Behind them, more figures spilled from the loading area through an open gate, closing the gap with unnerving consistency. I scanned the perimeter map for any asset I could use. The levee road had 2 retractable bollard gates tied into the flood control system. If I dropped them at the right moment, they could block vehicle access and maybe slow foot traffic enough to give Randall and Sarah a lead. I waited until they were halfway up the incline, then triggered the bollard cycle. The hydraulic rams rose from the road with a slow, steady hum. Randall and Sarah cleared them without breaking stride. The first of pursuers would reach them in seconds. On the water-level camera, the drifting shapes finally reached the anchorage. For a moment they clung to the structure's edge, then began to climb, their movements jerky but purposeful. They weren't using the ladder bolted into the concrete. They were finding perches in seams and ridges that no normal climber would consider viable. I realized with cold certainty that once they reached the platform, there would be no meaningful barrier between the river and the service road. The Civic District feeds were now showing engagement in the central square. Emergency lighting bathed the scene in a stark white glow, turning every shadow into a hard-edged silhouette. Armored units were positioned in a semicircle around the main fountain, their mounted lights cutting into the surrounding streets. The advancing figures moved into that light without pause. Some fell under the concentrated force applied by the defenders, but the gaps closed instantly, the mass shifting forward as if pulled by a single invisible line. On the shoreline feed, Randall and Sarah had reached the crest of the levee road. The camera angle didn't allow me to see the fire station beyond, but the fact that I still had power to the grid in that block suggested it was holding. The pursuers were just reaching the bollards when the second hydraulic gate dropped without a command from me. For a moment, I thought it was an automatic safety cycle, until the system flagged, "Remote Override Unverified Source." That was when I realized someone else was in our network. Not just tapping the feed, operating it. And if they had access to control the gates, they could undo everything we'd locked down since the night began. My first instinct was to pull the local breaker on the network hub, but that would have dropped every camera, lock, and floodgate we still had in the perimeter. We'd be blind, and without visual confirmation, Command wouldn't greenlight any countermeasures. That was probably the point. Whoever was inside our system didn't need to dismantle everything at once. They just had to make us choose between sight and control, then bleed us dry one piece at a time. Kim noticed me freezing on the console and stepped closer. "Talk to me," she said, not loud enough for the others to hear over the chatter of the comms room. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I started pulling the gate override logs from the last 10 minutes. Normally, the system tagged each action with an operator ID tied to a workstation. This time, the signature was scrambled. No ID, no terminal location. Just a generic, authenticated stamp that meant the command had come from inside our approved perimeter but wasn't tied to any human account. That wasn't a glitch. Someone had deliberately stripped the metadata. The feed from the levee road stuttered just for a second, like a heartbeat skipped in the network. When it came back, the angle had shifted slightly, as if the camera's remote pivot had been used to look somewhere else before being returned to its original view. I glanced at the access queue. Sure enough, there was an unlogged movement request at the same timestamp. It felt like being watched by something that didn't care if I knew it was there. On screen, Randall and Sarah were still moving, but slower now. Randall glancing back every few steps. The group behind them had split, half still following, the rest fanning toward the industrial park's perimeter. That wasn't random. They were cutting off routes. I scanned ahead to the fire station cameras. The floodlights were still on, but I caught movement on the north side of the lot. Shapes slipping in and out of the shadows, low to the ground, moving in short bursts. The station crew didn't seem to have noticed yet. The console chimed. Another gate override request, this one for the North River barricade. I denied it instantly, locking it at the hardware level. The denial should have triggered an alert in the system, but nothing appeared. That meant they'd already suppressed the warnings. Whoever this was, they weren't just skilled. They'd been inside long enough to understand our protocols better than most of our own operators. A low hum built in the room as the HVAC kicked in overhead, though the air was already cold. The big screens reflected in the glass wall behind me, a faint double image of every live feed we had left. In that ghosted reflection, I caught a flicker on one of the far monitors, too fast to make out detail but human-shaped. When I turned, the feed was normal again. The comms traffic spiked, shouting, overlapping transmissions. Kim's headset lit with 3 incoming channels at once. I caught enough of the noise to pick out words like breach, garage, and inside. She began relaying orders, but her eyes kept flicking to my console, to the frozen logs and the locked gate icons. She understood, even without me saying it. The perimeter wasn't just under assault from the outside. We were already compromised from within. And whatever was inside wasn't done yet. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.